Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's Top 10 90s Half-Hour Comedy Shows. This video is where I count down my top 10 favorite half-hour comedy shows of the 90s. I originally intended this to be just about sitcoms, but then found I couldn't actually find 10 sitcoms I really liked that much, so I had to include all kinds of half-hour comedy shows, which also include sketch comedy shows, animated comedies, and even cartoon shows aimed at kids. However, I am limiting it to half-hour shows, so that would exclude shows like Saturday Night Live because that's an hour and a half long. And these shows had to air in the 90s, but it doesn't have to air mostly in the 90s. Anytime during the 90s is fine, but I will only be judging the seasons that did air in the 90s. So if a show started before the 90s or continued on beyond the 90s, those years won't be looked at, and I will only be looking at seasons that aired during the 90s. So before I jump into my top 10 favorites, let me start off with my bottom 3 worst half-hour comedy shows of the 90s. However, to do a worst list of sitcoms of any decade is almost too easy, so I decided to limit myself to sitcoms that are generally considered to be great. So in a way, this is an overrated list. So in order to make my bottom 3 worst list, the show has to this day, have a sizable fan base, so this list may piss some people off, but it's how I feel. So coming in at number 3 worst is Friends. I had to mention this show because it's presented like it's one of the greatest sitcoms of all time, and it's really not good. I will admit that I watched and liked the first season, and I remember it being quite funny because that's when they had the monkey, which was awesome, and the storyline of Ross having a crush on Rachel. But after this year, it went downhill, got repetitive, and everyone ended up sleeping with everyone, and they created couples that made no sense, like Monica and Chandler. I mean, come on, that's just stupid. So the first season was okay, but beyond that, I can't stand this show. Number 2 worst is Everybody Loves Raymond. I just flat out cannot stand this show, period. My mother loved this show and thus would have it on all the time where I lived, and it drove me insane. It's completely beyond me how anyone can find this the slightest bit funny. I mean, it has these, parents going around acting like assholes, except that's not the least bit funny. And the brother who has this ridiculously deep voice, is that supposed to be funny? I don't know. Then of course Raymond himself, who's just whiny and annoying, and his relationship with his wife is a cheap imitation from Home Improvement, which did it better. So yeah, just fuck, I cannot stand this show. And my number 1 worst popular half-hour comedy show of the 90s is Will and Grace. I remember I first saw an episode of this show, my mouth was literally hanging open. I could not believe how unfunny this show was. The jokes were just so dumb. Now granted, there were many sitcoms that I saw in which I had a similar reaction. However, most of those shows quickly went off the air as everyone recognized how much they sucked, which is what I thought would happen with this show. But then it started winning Emmys for Best Comedy Show and became a huge success. What the literal fuck? So I thought maybe I just caught a bad episode, so I gave it another shot, and it was just as dumb. I consider it one of life's greatest mysteries of the world on how in the hell anyone can find this crap remotely funny, which I put right up there with What Happens After You Die and What Is the Meaning of Life, making this my number 1 worst popular half-hour comedy show of the 90s. Okay, so enough negativity. Let me get into my top 10 favorite half-hour comedy shows of the 90s, starting with my number 10, The Tick. The Tick is a superhero spoof cartoon based off a comic book, and it was originally marketed towards children, appearing with other kids' cartoons. However, later they found it worked better as a comedy aimed towards adults and started airing the cartoon prime time. After it went off air, it became a cult hit in syndication, becoming one of Comedy Central's most popular shows. For me, The Tick is pretty hit or miss, as most of the time it does come off as a typical cartoon with elements of satire and that mock other superhero shows. However, there are moments of the show that stick out as particularly hilarious, such as the world's most comfortable chair, which when one sits in it, they have a hard time getting out of it because it's just so comfortable, such as when the Tick ended up sitting in it when he needed to go out and stop a supervillain. He found it really difficult to get out of the chair. He was like, must get out of the chair! And plus the Tick's sidekick, Arthur, who is a weird moth thingy, who was basically just a normal nerdy guy, added to the comedy a lot. So overall, I did find this one of the more memorable comedies of the 90s. Coming in at number 9 is South Park. Now, I was never a huge South Park fan, which is why it may seem low on the list compared to where many others would have it. In fact, I only really watched South Park in the 90s, and I've only seen several episodes since, and I'm surprised that the show is still going, and I couldn't tell you if the modern episodes are any good or not because I haven't seen them. However, I was quite a fan of the first couple of seasons, which did air in the late 90s, which has some classic moments that everyone was buzzing about, like the drugs are bad Mookie, and Chef singing about sucking on his chocolatey salty balls. Put him in your mouth! And of course the show drew a lot of attention and raised a lot of eyebrows for killing off one of its main characters in every single episode, which was hilarious at first, but it did get quite old after a while. In fact, I would say of South Park overall that it's only good in small doses, like eating super rich chocolate. It just becomes too much at times, and sometimes it gets annoying the way that the showrunners just be controversial just for the sake of controversial. They're like the equivalent of internet trolls who just say shit to piss people off and don't really have any meaningful commentary behind it. But it was a breakthrough show, so I did include it on my top 10, even if it's not as high as most people think it should be. Coming in at number 8 is The State. Some people may not have even heard of this show, but it is a half-hour comedy sketch show that aired for 4 seasons on MTV in the early 90s. It's noted as being a bizarre sketch comedy show. In fact, after watching many of the sketches, my first reaction is to go, what the fuck? It was a very hit or miss, as well as most of the time it was just weird and not at all funny, but when it was funny, it was really funny, such as the reoccurring skit they had with Louie, who carried a pair of golf balls around and would go to parties where everyone would cheer him on and be, hey, it's Louie! And then they would offer Louie drinks and dips and spreads to him, and every time he would hold up his golf balls and say, I want to dip my balls in it! And yeah, that is as silly as it sounds. My personal favorite was when he showed up at the Last Supper, where the apostles kept cheering him on as he said he wanted to dip his balls in things, whereas Jesus was not amused. And when the Romans came for Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus pointed them in the direction of the man screaming about his balls. Or my personal favorite sketch is about hostage takers who get in a standoff with the police and they demand a ransom of $150. The police then scramble to put the money together from their wallets, and they manage to get enough money that they hand out to the hostage takers as they put them under arrest and put them in a van. The lead hostage taker and the lead detective then reminisce about the game of chess that they were playing, and then when one of the officers informs the detective that they ran out of room in the van, so the lead hostage taker gets away, to which he replies, checkmate. And yeah, funny shit like that gives me really fond memories of this underrated show. Number 7 is Mr. Show with Bob and David. So this was a unique sketch comedy show that aired on HBO, starring David Cross and Bob Odenkirk, who since worked together a lot. I was already familiar with David Cross from his stand-up comedy, but this show introduced me to Bob Odenkirk, who of course is now best known for his role as Saul Goodman on Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul. The thing that was probably most unique about Mr. Show is that each skit flowed seamlessly into the next. For example, the character in one skit would be watching something on TV, and at the end of that skit, and then the next skit would start by showing what was on the TV. In fact, they would begin each episode doing a monologue on stage, and the skits would always transition from that monologue, such as protesters would show up protesting the show, and then we'd follow the protesters as they go outside outside, and that would be the first skit. It would be about those protesters. So this is another show that was a bit hit or miss with sketches that could be pretty freaking crazy. However, they were pretty consistently funny, even though if there wasn't any huge standout moments, you could guarantee each episode would have some crazy funny moments. Coming in at number 6 is the short-lived cartoon done by the creators of The Simpsons, The Critic. And it stars SNL alumni Jon Lovitz. It's quite an underrated gem, in my opinion. It was canceled only after 1 year on ABC, then it was picked up by Fox for another year, and then it was canceled for good. And much like the Tick's Acclaim's cult status in reruns, came to it on Comedy Central, where it became another one of the most beloved shows. Now, I will admit that I bought this recently on DVD, and it wasn't quite as good as I remembered it being. I think I prefer the Fox year to the ABC year, where instead of having jokes about how he could never get laid, they gave him a cute girlfriend who had a young daughter that his son befriended. I thought that set up a really nice dynamic. So the show followed a fat critic whose catchphrase was "It stinks," as he would trash any Hollywood blockbuster and he would prefer pretentious, artsy foreign films, which is a subject matter near and dear to my heart. This gave the show a lot of chances to spoof movies, although most of these are a bit dated now, as are many of the pop culture references. The show had a lot of classic moments, such as the episode where his boss Duke ran for president, and it's scary how similar this is to Donald Trump in present times, where it's a billionaire running for president just for publicity and money. But the one moment that was hilarious was when Duke staged a sham marriage for publicity, and when a reporter called him out on it and asked, "What do you say to the people who claim your marriage is nothing but a sham?" he responded by saying, "Well, I would say, gaze into the hypnotic power of my evil eye." And then his eyes turned like big circles, and the reporter was like, "How may I serve you, evil one?" And that was hilarious. Or the time when the critic's father was on a plane and went to see who was flying it, and he saw it was a penguin flying it, and he was like, "Wait a second, penguins can't fly. Penguins can't fly!" And as soon as he said that, the plane crashes. And his other really crazy, just off the walls moments like this. However, the show did get carried away with way too many fat jokes, which can become really tiresome when I binge watch, but overall, it's a pretty crazy show. Number 5 on my list is Beavis and Butthead, a classic show with a simple premise about a couple of idiots that just giggle endlessly and binge on TV. The premise itself doesn't sound that interesting, however, this show about idiots actually managed to come off as intelligent satire and was often hilarious. It was often a commentary on how dumbed down teenage culture of the 90s was, and there wasn't really a smart character you could identify with on the show, from their hippie teacher of Mr. Van Driesen, where the guy, whenever the guy plays an acoustic song, he gets the crap beat out of him at the end, or the military-like teacher who came off as a bit of an asshole, to the principal who always acted like he had too much caffeine, to his wannabe friend Stuart, to the badass that they idolized Todd, to their middle-aged neighbor Tom Anderson. None of these characters were particularly came off as particularly smart people that you could admire. Their wacky adventures, as they would often misunderstand what's going on and try some elaborate schemes to get chicks or money, which would also always end in pain, ended up being hilarious. As was the gag that whenever Beavis had too much caffeine, he turned into the Great Cornholio. All in all, a hilarious show that managed to make commentary on contemporary culture by following a couple of idiots just sitting on their ass watching TV all day. He said ass. Coming in at number 4 is Dexter's Laboratory, an animated show aimed mostly at children, or so they claim. However, I found the show particularly enjoyable when accompanied with some herbal supplements. In fact, I'm entirely sure that every showrunner on Cartoon Network is a giant stoner. You cannot convince me otherwise. Dexter's Laboratory in particular, I think, was one of the best shows the channel has ever put out in the late 90s. Later, there were other shows like the Powerpuff Girls and Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends, and all, not to mention all the Adult Swim shows that would come later on, but that's more of the 2000s. I've never really been a fan of Nickelodeon shows like Ren and Stimpy or Rugrats. For me, Cartoon Network was where it was at, and this show has always had crazy comedy that I think was actually aimed a bit more at adults, even though it was disguised as a kid's show. Dexter's Laboratory told the story of a young kid with a secret lab that his parents didn't know about, but his annoying sister did and would often wreak havoc in it, where he would often do all sorts of crazy stuff, from making someone into a giant, to making a sad robot, to trying to learn a language literally overnight. It was always a blast. Coming in at number 3 is News Radio. One of the most underrated shows of all time, in my opinion. News Radio was the ensemble show with such names as Phil Hartman, Dave Foley, Stephen Root, Andy Dick, and Joe Rogan. News Radio focused on an office at a news radio station where everyone who worked there, except for the station manager, Dave Nelson, was absolutely insane. From the egotistical Bill McNeil, played by Hartman, to the co-host, the vain Catherine Duke, to the other crazy personalities like Matthew, Beth, Joe, and Lisa, and of course the most insane of them all was the multi-billionaire station owner Jimmy James, who despite being a billionaire would spend most of his time hanging out at the radio station. This is one of the best examples of an ensemble comedy I've ever seen, as the comedy simply works so well and the character quirks and outrageous behavior is contrasted nicely by Dave Foley's main character, who serves as the straight man of the series. I think of insane moments such as when Jimmy James claimed to be flying around the world in a hot air balloon, but really he was just in the station filming it with the help of Joe. Or when Bill McNeil obsesses over an introduction Dave is supposed to give for an important speech he's making, where he ends up yelling at Dave and losing his voice. Or the time Jimmy James plays practical jokes on The Office, saying it's April Fool's Day when really it's in March or something, while Bill tries to impress a reporter. I've never seen a comedy show with such a great ensemble cast that works so well together. However, it was only good for its first 3 seasons and started to go downhill in season 4 and became totally unwatchable after Phil Hartman's tragic passing, and he was replaced by John Lovitz, who wasn't nearly as funny, and overall the writing in the show just got horrible. However, the first 3 seasons are pure gold. Coming in at number 2 is The Simpsons. The Simpsons has become such an iconic show and household name I probably don't even need to elaborate more. The Simpsons was best in the 90s. The first couple of seasons that aired in the 80s weren't that good, and after the 90s the show totally went downhill to the point where I don't even know why it's still on the air. Having the golden years of The Simpsons were seasons 3 through 9 that all aired in the 90s and were all pure gold, filled with some of the funniest moments in history. The lead character themselves, the Simpsons, were often hilarious and interesting to follow, but perhaps what this show is known best for is its rich cast of supporting characters, from Chief Wiggum to Ned Flanders to Krusty the Clown to Milhouse to Moe to Dr. Nick to the comic book guy to, okay, I could go on forever, but that's the point. Watching The Simpsons felt like a fully developed world where you can step into and just see hilarious familiar faces, and during the 90s it was so enriched with hilarious episodes that would just blow you away every time. In fact, I do plan on eventually doing a top 20 favorite episodes video for The Simpsons, because there are just so many great episodes and moments to get into, too many for this video. But suffice to say, The Simpsons was one of the highlights of the 90s beyond simply comedies and any art form. The Simpsons was a huge impact on 90s culture. And my number one favorite half-hour comedy show of the 90s is Seinfeld. Now, Seinfeld was reportedly the show about nothing. However, I watched a few videos challenging this claim and saying Seinfeld was in fact about something. It was about four neurotic New York friends whining about what would to most be meaningless details. Classic episodes include them getting lost in a parking garage, waiting for a table at a Chinese restaurant, getting soup from the soup Nazi, entering a contest to see who could go the longest without masturbating, to George trying to figure out who stole his candy bar and having a candy bar lineup to catch the crook. In other words, it wasn't really about nothing per se, but the subject matter was extremely trivial, which I suppose is where this show drew its comedic power from, as it always managed to be extremely hilarious. And of course, a major factor on why the show was consistently great had to do with this main cast of four characters who were richly developed and hilarious to watch. From the neurotic, clean freak Jerry to his best friend, the slacker who always had a scheme to get out of doing things George, to their friend Elaine who always had to have the upper hand in any social situation, to his very eccentric unemployed neighbor Kramer who always had a get-rich scheme in mind, and along with a lot of other absurd quirks. And of course, all four of them were horrible at relationships, as they were very nitpicky and so would go through partners very quickly. Honestly, if I knew these people in real life, I wouldn't like them and would find them highly annoying. But they were absolutely hilarious to watch in a TV show. Not to mention, Seinfeld spawned a holiday that now atheists are turning into a real-life holiday recently with Festivus. Get your Festivus poll out and get ready for the feats of strength, because Seinfeld isn't just a hilarious show, it's a cultural phenomenon, making it my number one favorite half-hour comedy show of the 90s. So that's it for my top 10 half-hour comedy shows of the 90s. Be sure to check out my channel this week for 90s Week, and also check out my channel for many more videos on shows like Game of Thrones, Star Trek, Mr. Robot, Dark Matter, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.